Alright, we're back with another video. Today we are ranking the main bosses in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice from worst to best, not including any of the inner bosses from the Gauntlets of Strength or any of the obligatory mini-bosses. This list is of course highly subjective, so go ahead and tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. Without further ado, let's get right into the list. At number 15 we have the Folding Screen Monkeys. I'm not a big fan of puzzle bosses or gimmick bosses, which becomes apparent with this ranking. A big reason for this is the extreme lack of replay value. Once you figure out how to beat this boss once, it becomes merely an annoyance on subsequent playthroughs. Luckily there are ways of beating this easily, using a Gatchin sugar. Another thing I don't like in Sekiro is gank fights, which is why the Headless Ape rematch lands on number 14. I have no idea why FromSoft thought that fighting two giant apes in a small cave was a good idea. This fight is a blatant reuse of the second phase of the Garden Ape fight, with one extra ape added in a much smaller arena. Sekiro is probably the worst FromSoft game at dealing with multiple enemies, which means that you have to try and separate the two apes in this small cave, which can be very annoying. The one saving grace about this fight is that the other ape has a relatively small health pool, so the fight itself is quite easy if you're patient. At number 13 we have the Divine Dragon. Another gimmick boss lands toward the bottom of my list. This one might upset some people, as I often see this boss praised for its incredible scenery and visuals, and I completely understand those arguments. It's just that I don't really care about that stuff too much. If the fight itself is boring, no visuals in the world can mitigate that for me. The reason I'm ranking this higher than the Folding Screen Monkeys is that I don't find this fight nearly as annoying as that one, and the gimmick is somewhat satisfying with the lightning reversals, but absolutely no replay value for me, which is why the Divine Dragon still lands toward the bottom of the list. And the trees at the beginning are super annoying, like why? FromSoft. Now we are leaving the worst bosses behind. All the remaining bosses on this list I like to some extent, and they all have some replay value in my opinion. The Guardian Ape lands at spot number 12. I'm not a big fan of the first phase of this fight. I find it a little bit too erratic. It literally throws shit at you. And even though it has some spots where you can deflect the attacks, there's nothing satisfying about the first phase in my opinion. The big beast bosses do not generally work well in Sekiro in my opinion, with one exception, as you will see later. The surprise second phase is a cool plot twist on a first blind playthrough, and the second phase is actually a much better fight in my opinion. The fact that the ape now has a sword makes the fight less of a big beast fight and more of a normal Sekiro fight. Deflecting the big overhead strike and using the spear afterwards is super satisfying and is the saving grace of this fight. The terror attack is very annoying though. Moving on to number 11, we have the boss with the most memorable name of them all. This is the first real boss that you encounter on your Sekiro journey, and it can be quite a challenge for players that are new to the game. I think that the difficulty of this boss is really well balanced, considering he's very early in the game. He's not a complete pushover in subsequent playthroughs either in my experience, which I really appreciate. I think his attacks can be deceptively hard to deflect sometimes, but once you get better with the timing, they are very satisfying to hit. Gyobo has really large windows where you can punish him, which balances out the difficulty perfectly. Overall, this is a boss that I always enjoy fighting, and he would be higher if the difficulty was higher. But that would not be expected from a boss this early in the game. At spot number 10, we find the Great Shinobi Owl. This fight is for some reason one of the bosses that I struggle the most with on subsequent playthroughs of this game. I just never seem to find a good rhythm in this fight, and there are a lot of shenanigans going on, like poison, firecrackers, and a health blocking curse, which I'm not a huge fan of. The deflects aren't that satisfying other than the quick double attack, and his health pool feels huge. You have to take down his vitality quite a lot in order to break his posture. What I like about this fight is the difficulty, which saves this boss from ending up lower down on this list. It's also kind of cool that you're fighting your mentor. At number 9 we have probably my biggest nemesis in this game, Lady Butterfly. Depending on which ending you're going for, this boss is optional. She's available super early, and if you choose to fight her after Gyobo, as I did on my first playthrough, you're probably in for a world of trouble. unless you're some sort of god at the game. If you're fighting her early in the game, you've probably not learned the importance of being aggressive and doing posture damage, which is vitally important in this fight. My feelings towards this boss are kind of mixed. Beating her early in the game on my first playthrough felt like such an achievement, but fighting her later in the game on subsequent playthroughs, I realized that she's kind of a pushover, but I guess that's natural. She's a really good skill check and teaches you that posture damage is almost always more important than vitality damage. The arena is daunting and she's a quite scary character. My biggest pet peeve with this fight is the illusions in the second phase. Sure, you can make her not summon them by being super aggressive and you can mitigate them with a snap seed, but that's a finite resource that you'll burn through on your first couple of attempts. None of these tactics worked for me as a new player on my first playthrough, so I had to resort to avoiding the butterflies by running away, which was super stressful and frustrating. All in all, I really like this boss fight as it teaches you the fundamentals of Sekiro and the aggressive playstyles gives a very satisfying combat. At spot number 8 we find the Corrupted Monk. I really like this fight. The deflects in this fight are probably the most satisfying in the entire game in my opinion. Even though this is a one-phase fight, it poses quite a challenge due to the Corrupted Monk's large health pool. You can make this fight significantly easier using snap seeds and divine confetti. You can even get a quick death blow with some witty use of gachin sugar, snap seeds and firecrackers. But I never resort to using any of these tricks since I want the fight to last as long as possible. Perfectly deflecting 4 or 5 attacks in a row and then getting a Mikiri counter is one of the most satisfying moments in the entire game. All in all, this is a really good fight and it really speaks to the strength of Sekiro's bosses that I have to put this all the way down at spot number 8. Moving on to number 7, we have Emma the Gentle Blade. This fight is a real heartbreaker. Going for the sure ending forces you to fight your companion Emma, which feels very bittersweet. The fight itself is awesome though. The rhythm of this fight is amazing and the deflects are very satisfying. It really feels like a dance. Stakes are high as well because she has the ability to punish you hard should you mess up the timing. What makes this fight not land higher on the list is the very short duration of it and the lack of difficulty, seeing as this is merely the precursor to the real boss fight of the sure ending, Ishin Ashina. Once you get the hang of the deflect timings and play aggressively, you will run through her in no time. Speaking of the sure ending, at number 6 we have Ishin Ashina. It's insane that I have to put such an amazing fight as low as number 6. This is where the S tier starts for me. All the remaining bosses could basically be number 1, and it was really difficult to rank them. This one is simply the one that I'm looking forward the least to of the remaining bosses. It's not as satisfying to dodge and deflect his attacks in my opinion, and I really don't like the fire attacks in the second phase. Especially the one where the ground bursts into flames. He can also dodge one of your attacks, which is both a cool quirk and quite annoying as it punishes an aggressive playstyle. But it's quite easy to adapt to and it definitely makes the boss different, but not in a good way in my opinion. But as I said, still an S tier boss. Just making the top 5 is the true Corrupted Monk. Obviously I like this boss for the same reasons that I like Corrupted Monk. And here there's just more of the good stuff. Deflecting this boss feels awesome and the stealth death blow in the second phase is really cool. And not too trivial to get. This is one of the best fights in the entire game and one that I feel is a little bit underrated. Just missing out on the top 3 is a boss that I see on top of a lot of these kinds of lists. Father Owl. As you saw earlier in this list, I'm not the biggest fan of the first Shinobi Owl fight. This one is obviously a lot better. I like the rhythm of this fight much more than the first Shinobi Owl. Non-stop aggression is rewarded in this fight, which I really like. The only real downside of this fight is the firecrackers in my opinion. Still not a big fan of them, even though they're quite easy to dodge. Father Owl might be the most difficult boss in the entire game, which is a big plus as well. The second phase is simply amazing. The usage of the owl is, although somewhat annoying, very nicely done and a really cool experience. The arena is one of my favorites as well, which is a bit counterintuitive because I have nightmares of it from my first encounter with Lady Butterfly. But it's sort of like a love-hate relationship. All in all, this is a terrific and super intense fight that very well could be number 1 on this list. In the number 3 spot, we have probably the most polarizing fight in all of Sekiro. And many of you will most likely disagree with this ranking, but it's the Demon of Hatred. This is one of the few big beast fights in Sekiro, and while I don't really like the other ones, this one just does it for me. In my opinion, it's the most difficult fight in all of Sekiro, maybe second to Father Owl. But this is the one that I struggled the most with on my first playthrough. You basically have to forget all you've learned about Sekiro up until this point. Deflecting is not really an option for most of his attacks, which should be a big downside to this fight, seeing how much I love the rhythm of the good deflect fights. And I'm gonna be honest, I hated this fight on my first playthrough. As I hadn't played any other FromSoft games when I first played Sekiro, I struggled immensely with this fight. I didn't use the fire umbrella either, so that was a huge disadvantage. But on subsequent playthroughs, once I learned to dodge his attacks effectively, I enjoyed this fight a lot, as I found out there was actually a nice rhythm to this fight, even though there aren't that many deflects. Now the Demon of Hatred is one of the fights that I look forward to the most when I play Sekiro. A fantastic fight. My number 2 spot is probably going to be a bit upsetting to many as well. I have Genichiro as the second best boss in all of Sekiro. This might be a surprise to many, as Genichiro is a boss you fight quite early on in your Sekiro journey. But the fight is so good. This is the best rhythmic fight in Sekiro in my opinion. Deflects are ultra satisfying, and on your first playthrough he is a fantastic skill check. The third phase is an amazing surprise phase as well. And I remember thinking that I finally beat the fight after like 3 hours just to get demolished by his lightning attacks, not knowing how I should reverse them yet. On subsequent playthroughs, Genichiro is a lot easier, of course, but it doesn't really matter. I always love fighting this boss, no matter if I beat him without getting hit or if he demolishes me. There's only one boss I love even more in this game, and at the number 1 spot, it's of course going to be Ishin the Sword Saint. Ishin is a transcendent boss, one of the best bosses in all of gaming. Of course he's going to be on top of my list. Beating this boss is probably the best feeling I've ever had over my 20-year gaming career, and that says a lot. I basically banged my head against the wall for 4 hours straight without blinking when I tried to conquer him on my first playthrough, and it wasn't even frustrating. The fight always felt fair, and I always felt that I had a chance to win, even though the fight is basically 4 phases long. The first phase is a short rematch against Genichiro, and you already know how I feel about him. This phase is nothing more than a warm-up for the Ishin fight. It can be a bit annoying to fight him every time you die to Ishin, but it's fine, as I love Genichiro. The first phase of Ishin is just a straight up mano-a-mano sword fight, and it's amazing. This is the bread and butter of Sekiro right here. The second phase is when all hell breaks loose and all the shenanigans start. Ishin pulls out a large spear and a Glock for some reason, in addition to his sword from the first phase. And this is where the difficulty of this fight really comes through. Short range, quick attacks, long range, Glock attacks, delayed spear attacks. Ishin throws everything at you in this phase, and it's phenomenal. The third and last phase of this fight is basically the second phase, but with lightning attacks, which makes it significantly easier and is an epic conclusion to a masterpiece of a game. Thank you all for watching. Let me know what you think about my ranking down in the comments, and I will see you all in the next one.